The bustling airport terminal hummed with the usual chaos, passengers moving in every direction, the air filled with the sound of rolling suitcases, and the murmur of voices all scrambling to get to their gates. Emily stood at the entrance of the first-class section of the gate, feeling a sense of excitement, mixed with dread. The flight was bound to be packed, and the pressure to maintain a perfect service was on her shoulders as usual. Her eyes scanned the crowd, looking for the usual signs of troublemakers, the ones who wouldn't follow the rules, the ones who thought they were above the rest of the passengers. She wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but she had a reputation to uphold. As the flight attendants began ushering passengers into the line, Emily noticed him for the first time, standing at the entrance of the first-class boarding lane. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had an air of confidence that set him apart from the crowd. His suit was a deep navy blue, the kind that screamed money. Without saying a word, his shoes polished to perfection, reflecting the overhead lights. He didn't stand out in a crowd. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without lifting a finger. Emily kept her gaze fixed on him. As he walked toward the gate, his expression was unreadable, but there was something about him that made her uneasy, a certain stillness in the way he moved that made her think he wasn't just another businessman rushing to get on a plane. This was a man who had nothing to prove. As she looked closer, she noticed his face, his jawline sharp and defined with a look that was both calm and slightly aloof. It made her feel like he was a part of a world she could never truly understand. He didn't smile as he walked by, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the people around him. He didn't seem to notice her at all, or maybe he was choosing not to. Emily didn't know which one was worse. She didn't mind it, though she had a job to do. And it wasn't to stand there staring at some rich guy she'd never seen before. She had to focus on making sure everything went smoothly. But for some reason she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way he moved, or the way the other passengers seemed to give him a wider berth than anyone else. But there was a strange sense of power that surrounded him, and it made Emily uneasy. The last thing she needed was to deal with someone who thought they were above the rules. She had seen it all before, the entitled ones who believed they could push people around just because they had money. They didn't understand what it was like to work for a living, and Emily was determined to make sure they learned that lesson today. She glanced at the seat assignments. The flight was almost full, and there were only a few remaining first-class seats. The man was heading straight toward one of them. The seats near the front were always reserved for the most important passengers, but Emily wasn't sure if he was one of them yet. Not that it mattered to her. If he wanted to sit in the luxury section, then he would have to follow the rules like everyone else. She watched as he slid into his seat. Without a word, the flight attendant seated next to him exchanged a few words and handed him a drink, but he didn't seem to care about the small talk. Emily felt a flicker of irritation. It was clear he was trying to make a statement, but she was ready for him to do whatever he wanted. She would do her job as always, and if he wanted to test her, she would be ready. As the last few passengers boarded the plane, the atmosphere shifted. There was a buzz in the air as people found their seats and settled in. Emily moved briskly down the aisle, greeting passengers with a polite smile, but her eyes kept drifting back to the man seated in first class. He hadn't even looked up when she passed by the first time, and that only made her more determined to do her job to perfection. The flight attendants were all on high alert today, with the pressure of making sure everything ran smoothly, so she couldn't afford to let any disruptions slide. She adjusted her uniform and mentally prepared herself for whatever was about to unfold. But when she glanced up again, something about his presence caught her eye. He was still sitting in the same seat, but now there was something unsettling about the way he looked, almost like he was waiting for something. Emily couldn't put her finger on it, but it felt like a quiet challenge, the kind of challenge that came from someone who knew exactly how much power they wielded without ever having to say a word. It was the kind of power that made others uneasy, made them second guess their every move. It made her feel small in a way she hated. She snapped herself out of it, quickly taking a deep breath and reminding herself that she had a job to do, she had to stay in control. She wasn't going to let some stranger intimidate her, even if he seemed to have an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. It was time for the pre-flight safety demonstration. Emily walked over to the front of the plane and took her position, standing tall, ready to begin. As she started to speak, she noticed the man watching her closely, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. But she didn't let it distract her. She focused on her duties, delivering the speech with practiced ease. Even as she could feel the weight of his gaze, she finished the demonstration and walked back down the aisle to prepare for takeoff. But when she passed his seat again, she saw him adjusting his things like he was settling in for the long flight. His calm demeanor made her feel off balance. It was as though he was in control of everything around him. Without lifting a finger, she had seen passengers like this before, those who believed the world existed to serve them. But something about this man felt different. It wasn't arrogance. It was something more composed and cold, like he knew how much influence he held and didn't need to flaunt it. He didn't need to be loud or demanding. He was the kind of man who could get what he wanted without even trying. Emily turned away from him and went to check the cabin one last time. But her mind kept drifting back to the man in first class. She wasn't sure what it was about him that unsettled her so much. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or maybe it was the fact that she had no idea who he was. It was rare for someone to exude such confidence without giving away some clue about their identity. People like that usually had a presence that was hard to ignore. But he was different. He seemed almost invisible in his silence, and yet his presence was undeniable. As the flight finally began to taxi down the runway and the plane lifted off the ground, Emily felt a small sense of relief. She was in the air now and nothing else mattered. But as the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign was turned off, she found herself walking back toward first class. She knew she had to check on the passengers, make sure everyone was comfortable. And with the man in that seat, she felt an odd sense of duty, like she had to prove something not just to him, but to herself, that she could handle whatever was coming her way, even if it was someone who seemed too powerful to mess with. She took a deep breath and moved toward him. As Emily approached his seat, she felt her heart rate pick up, her mind racing with a mixture of annoyance and determination. She had dealt with plenty of rude passengers in her time, but something about him made her uneasy. It wasn't just his expensive appearance or his quiet confidence. It was the way he made her feel, as if he was watching her every move. She stood at the edge of his seat, taking a deep breath, before speaking, her voice firm, as she addressed him. "Excuse me, sir, but could you move your bags to the overhead compartment? I need to ensure there's enough space for all the passengers." He didn't react at first, not even a glance up. He just sat there, as if she hadn't said a word. Emily repeated herself, a bit louder this time, "Sir, I need you to move your bags, please." But still he didn't acknowledge her. It was as if she were invisible to him. Or maybe he just didn't care. She felt her frustration building, but she forced herself to stay calm, her training kicking in. She had dealt with passengers like him before, those who thought the rules didn't apply to them, those who were used to getting everything they wanted. Without question, this was no different. But when she saw his eyes slowly lift to meet hers, her breath caught in her throat. His gaze was calm, but piercing. His eyes held a depth that sent a chill through her. His face remained expressionless, but there was something in his stare that made her feel small. It was like he was studying her, as if waiting for her to make the next move. And for a brief moment, she hesitated. She couldn't explain it, but the intensity in his eyes made her feel like she had miscalculated somewhere along the way. But she wasn't about to back down now. She had a job to do. She stood her ground and repeated herself, this time with more authority, "Sir, I need you to move your bags now, or I'll have to get the captain involved." His lips twitched slightly, as if he found her insistence amusing, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked at her for what felt like an eternity. And then slowly he spoke, his voice low, And deliberate, you really don't know who I am, do you? Emily blinked, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? Who was he? She felt a sudden rush of panic. But she tried to mask it with a thin smile. I don't care who you are, sir, but I need you to move your bags now. He didn't seem offended by her response. In fact, he appeared almost unfazed. But she could feel the shift in the air. It was as if the whole plane had gone quiet, and all attention had turned toward them. Emily could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, but she refused to let it show. She wasn't about to let this man intimidate her. She had dealt with much worse than a rich guy who thought the world revolved around him. But there was something about the way he said it that made her feel like she was in over her head. When he spoke again, his voice was even calmer than before, a cold edge to it that sent a shiver down her spine. I suggest you reconsider how you handle this situation. He said, his words measured and deliberate. He didn't shout, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't even seem angry. But his words felt like a warning, not a request. Emily didn't know what to do with that. The confidence in his tone was unnerving. She had never been one to back down. But now doubt was starting to creep into her mind. She wasn't sure who she was dealing with anymore. But she wasn't going to show weakness. She forced a smile and took another step closer to him, looking down at the bags on the seat beside him. She was about to insist once more when he leaned back in his seat with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't need to say anything, but the silence between them was thick with tension. And that's when she realized he wasn't just another entitled passenger. He was something else, something far more dangerous. And she had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. Emily stood frozen for a moment, staring at him, her mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. His calm demeanor was almost infuriating. The way he spoke to her was like he was above it all, like she was some insignificant part of his world. She shook herself out of the trance, quickly, her pride rising again. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She wasn't going to back down, no matter how unsettling he seemed. She leaned in slightly and said more firmly, "Sir, I've already asked you to move your bags, and if you don't, I'll have no choice." But to involve the captain, the words felt almost robotic, coming out of her mouth like a script she'd read 1,000 times. But there was a knot falling in her stomach that she couldn't ignore. She had dealt with difficult passengers before. But this felt different. This wasn't just a man who thought the rules didn't apply to him. This was something else entirely. He continued to look at her, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence stretched on, and it was almost unbearable. The whole cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Every passenger was watching them. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her next move. She suddenly felt the weight of their judgment on her shoulders. But she refused to let it get to her. She could handle this. She had. She wasn't going to let this man walk all over her. He finally moved his hand, slowly placing it on the armrest, and then lifting his gaze to the front of the cabin, as though he had already dismissed her with a single glance. His body language screamed confidence. But there was something else in the air, something that made Emily's skin crawl. He wasn't worried at all. He wasn't even remotely fazed by her threats. His calmness was starting to crack her resolve. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could, he spoke first, in a voice so smooth it almost felt like velvet. "You don't seem to understand." He said his words slow, deliberate, like he was explaining something to a child. But she could feel the power in his tone, the way it made her feel small. He paused and glanced toward the back of the cabin, as though the conversation wasn't even worth his full attention. The arrogance was suffocating. He continued, speaking in the same measured tone. "You've made a mistake that will cost you more than you know." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The warning in his voice was unmistakable. She took a step back and opened her mouth to protest, but she couldn't find the words. The knot in her stomach tightened as she realized that she had no idea who this man was, or what he was capable of. She suddenly felt out of her depth. But she wasn't about to show it. She forced herself to take a steadying breath and straighten her posture. "Okay, sir," she said, her voice steady, but a little quieter. "I will be reporting this to the captain. I'm afraid I have no other choice." She turned to walk away, but as she did she heard him speak again, his voice so soft she almost missed it. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't make this public." There was a cold edge to his voice now, a warning that made her pause for just a split second. She turned back to look at him, but he was already looking at her with the same unflinching gaze. Emily swallowed hard. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she was walking into, but the way he spoke made her feel like she was already in way over her head. And she couldn't back out now. She had no choice but to follow through with the plan. And yet something in the back of her mind told her that this wasn't just a flight. This wasn't just a job. This was about to turn into something far more dangerous than she ever expected. She took another step toward the front of the plane, but as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet understand. Emily turned away from him, her mind spinning. As she walked toward the front of the plane, her thoughts racing with uncertainty. She had no idea who this man was, but something about him felt wrong. Something told her that she was walking into a storm she wasn't prepared for. She reached the front of the cabin and pressed the button for the intercom. The flight was already in the air, the seatbelt sign off. But she felt an uneasy tension in the air that she couldn't shake. She was about to report him to the captain when a voice behind her froze her in place. Emily, she heard her manager's voice, sounding strained. He was coming toward her at a fast pace, his expression tight and nervous. She turned to face him. His eyes were wide with panic. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Emily tried to speak, but her words got stuck in her throat. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She hadn't expected him to intervene. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her confrontation with the man. But now it was clear that something was happening that she couldn't explain. "You need to come with me now," her manager said, his voice trembling. "Just follow me, please." Emily nodded, numbly unable to say anything. She turned and walked with him toward the rear of the plane, where the small staff area was located. Her manager didn't say another word as they moved quickly through the aisles. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her as she passed by them. It felt like everyone was watching, like they all knew something she didn't, something that made her feel small. As they reached the back of the plane, Emily's manager stopped suddenly and turned to face her, his eyes still wide with disbelief. "Listen," he said in a low voice. "Don't say anything, just listen to me carefully. You have no idea who you're dealing with," he told her, his words making her stomach drop. His face was pale now, and his hands were shaking. "He's not just another passenger, Emily. This man is Xavier King, the owner of the airline." Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to process his words, but it felt like the world had just tilted on its axis. Everything she thought she knew shattered in that instant. She didn't know what to say. "Xavier King." She whispered the name like it was something foreign to her. "Yes," her manager replied. "He's one of the richest men in the world, and he's part owner of this airline. Do you understand who you've just crossed?" Emily felt like the floor had fallen out from under her. Her mind was racing, trying to keep up with the reality of the situation. But it was too much, too fast. She had just made a scene with one of the most powerful men in the world, and now she was standing in the back of the plane, completely powerless. How could she have known? How could she have possibly known? He was so calm, so collected. She had no idea he had been watching her, like she was nothing more than a passing annoyance to him. Everything about the encounter now felt like a nightmare. But there was no waking up from it. She had already made her choice. Now she had to face the consequences. Her manager's face twisted in fear as he continued speaking. "He's not just some billionaire with too much time on his hands, Emily. This man can destroy careers with a single word. And you just humiliated him in front of everyone." He said it so quietly, it almost sounded like a warning. Emily could only nod numbly. She had no idea what to say, no idea what to do. She was in way over her head. And the worst part was she didn't even know how deep it went. She had no idea how much trouble she was in. But she knew one thing for sure: she had just made a mistake that could ruin her life forever, and there was no way to fix it now. Emily stood there in stunned silence, her manager's words echoing in her head over and over Xavier King, the owner of the airline. She had just humiliated one of the most powerful men in the world, and now she was left to deal with the fallout. She couldn't breathe properly, her chest tight and constricted, like someone was pressing down on her. The weight of what she had just done hit her with full force. She had always prided herself on being confident, assertive in her role, but now she felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. She glanced toward the front of the plane, her gaze involuntarily drifting to the first-class section, where Xavier King sat still, calm as ever, with that chilling look of indifference on his face. He hadn't even looked back when her manager had rushed her away from the scene, like she was just another minor inconvenience. But now that she knew who he was, everything about their encounter felt different. Everything about the way he had acted felt like it had been a calculated test, a way to remind her of her place in this world. And she had failed. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. But the fear didn't go away. It only deepened as her manager paced in front of her, his voice low and frantic. "You need to go apologize to him," he said, his voice shaking in a way Emily had never heard from him. "Before, you need to go to him and beg for his forgiveness, before this turns into something much worse." But Emily couldn't move. She couldn't bring herself to take a single step forward towards him. All she could think of was how powerless she felt, how everything she had worked for could be ripped away in an instant. She looked up at her manager, his face a mix of fear and pity, his eyes pleading with her to understand just how serious this was. "Do you have any idea what he can do to you?" he asked, his voice cracking. She stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. It felt like her world was crumbling around her. She had never been in this position before. She had never had to beg for forgiveness from anyone, much less someone as untouchable as Xavier King. But she knew deep down that if she didn't take action, it would be the end of everything she had worked for. She had always been a fighter, but now all her strength felt like it was draining away with every passing second. The silence between them stretched on, and her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to face him. She didn't want to admit that she had made such a massive mistake. But deep down she knew there was no other choice. Her manager was right. If she didn't apologize, this situation would only get worse. There was no way out. She could already feel the eyes of the passengers on her every time she passed through the aisles. She felt their judgment, their whispers, the weight of their gazes heavy on her shoulders. But now it wasn't just the passengers she had to worry about. It was Xavier King himself. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and she had no idea how to fix it. She wiped her hands on her uniform and took a deep breath, but it did little to calm her nerves. The thought of facing him filled her with dread, but there was no escaping it, not anymore. She turned to her manager, nodding stiffly. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll go to him. I'll apologize." Her manager gave her a look of both relief and concern, but he didn't say anything more. He just motioned for her to go, and she did without another word. She walked slowly down the narrow aisle, her footsteps feeling louder than usual as she approached the first-class section. The tension in the air was palpable. It felt like every step she took made the weight of the situation heavier and heavier with each passing moment. But as she reached his seat, she found herself frozen, unable to take the final step. The man who had once seemed like just another rude passenger was now something far more terrifying than she had ever imagined, and standing before him, she realized she had no idea how to approach him, no idea how to make this right. Emily stood at the edge of the first-class cabin, her palms sweating as she gripped the armrest, trying to steady herself. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she looked at Xavier King, his presence more imposing than ever. He hadn't turned to look at her. When she approached, he didn't seem to care that she was standing there waiting for him to acknowledge her. He was still calm, his face expressionless, his eyes focused on something beyond her, as if she were nothing more than a shadow passing through his world. And that thought made her stomach twist. It reminded her just how out of place She was how much she didn't belong here, how powerless. She felt standing before someone who could crush her. Without lifting a finger, her breath hitched. But she refused to let herself falter. She had to do this. She had no choice. She couldn't lose everything, not over something like this. She had to apologize. She had to make this right. She stepped closer to him. But still he didn't acknowledge her. He just sat there with that cold, unreadable expression on his face. Emily swallowed hard, and then took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage. She had left. She had never begged for forgiveness in her life. But now she was forced to. She had no other option. Sir, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I owe you an apology. She hesitated for a moment, trying to steady her racing thoughts. I didn't realize who you were. I didn't mean to disrespect you. She said the words quickly, hoping they would sound sincere. She could feel her throat tightening, but she pushed through it. I was just doing my job. I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. She finished, her voice quiet but firm. She waited for him to respond, for him to say something, anything to acknowledge her. But he didn't move. He didn't even blink. His gaze remained locked ahead, as if she weren't even there. Emily felt the heat rising in her face, the humiliation sinking in. She had done everything she was supposed to do. She had apologized. She had owned up to her mistake. And yet he still hadn't even acknowledged her existence. She was just standing there in front of him, vulnerable and exposed, feeling more foolish by the second. But just as she was about to turn and walk away, something in his eyes shifted. It was subtle, at first a flicker of something beneath his calm exterior. But it was there, and it made her stop dead in her tracks. He slowly turned his head to look at her, his gaze now focused entirely on her. And for the first time since she had approached him, he spoke, his voice smooth and calculated. I see you figured it out, he said, his words cold and deliberate. There was no hint of warmth in his tone, but something about it made her heart skip a beat. He knew she had made a mistake. He knew she understood the gravity of the situation. But instead of offering some kind of reassurance, or even a simple acknowledgement of her apology, he simply stared at her, as if he was waiting for something more, something that she hadn't given him. Yet Emily felt her chest tighten even more, the pressure building inside her, as she waited for him to say more. But his silence was suffocating. She had no idea what he wanted from her, or how far he intended to take this situation. She could feel the fear creeping up on her again, the realization settling in that she had no control over this anymore, no control over what he might do next. She had never been this vulnerable in her entire life, standing there in front of him, exposed with nothing but her apology as her only defense. She tried to take another breath, but it felt shallow and strained. The words caught in her throat again. I understand the situation, sir, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want to make things right. But his eyes never wavered from hers. His expression never changed as he let her words hang in the air. Between them, a dangerous silence settling in. She didn't know what was coming next. She didn't know if she had done enough, or if this would spiral into something much worse than she had ever imagined. But in that moment, standing before him, all she could do was wait and pray that she hadn't made a mistake that would haunt her forever. The silence between them stretched on, and for a moment Emily wondered if she had said something wrong, if her apology hadn't been enough, if it was too little, too late. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, her hands clammy, as she waited for him to respond. But Xavier King just stared at her, his expression unreadable, the intensity in his eyes making her feel like she was under some kind of inspection, like he was seeing straight through her, like she was just another puzzle to be solved. It was suffocating, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. But she refused to look away. She had come this far. She wasn't going to back down now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice low and calculated. I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. Emily, his words were sharp and deliberate, each one falling heavy in the air. But he didn't sound angry, not at all. In fact, his tone was almost detached, as though he were explaining something obvious to a child. You've made an error in judgment, a costly one, he continued. But what you need to realize is that there are consequences to this kind of mistake, consequences that you won't be able to escape just because you say sorry. Emily felt a cold chill run through her veins. She wanted to speak, to explain, to tell him that she didn't mean for any of this to happen. But the words wouldn't come. She opened her mouth, but only silence followed his words, wrapped around her like chains, making it impossible to say anything. She felt trapped, like she had stepped into a world she didn't understand, a world where people like Caviar King controlled everything, and there was no room for mistakes, no room for second chances. He leaned back in his seat, slightly, his eyes still fixed on her, his lips curling into a faint smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a shiver down her spine, because it wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile that held something darker, something more dangerous hidden beneath the surface. You think apologizing will fix this, don't you? He said, his voice dripping with quiet amusement. But you're wrong. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. And just like that, Emily's heart seemed to drop into her stomach. She could feel the blood draining from her face. She had no idea what he meant. What was he going to do to her? What kind of consequences was he talking about? She had no answers, only a growing sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. He continued, speaking, his voice soft, but with an edge that made every word feel like a warning. You see, Emily, in my world, people like you don't make mistakes like this. And when they do, they don't get to just walk away with a simple apology. He said, his words carrying a weight that felt almost final. I could destroy your career with a single word if I chose to, but I'm not going to do that, he said, his tone shifting slightly as though he were granting her some kind of mercy. But the tension in his words was still palpable. You don't deserve mercy, not after what you did, but I'll give you a chance to prove yourself, he said, this time, his eyes never leaving hers. Prove yourself to me, and I'll consider this mistake forgiven, but fail, and there will be no coming back from it. Emily didn't know what to say. She was speechless. His words were like a punch to the gut. They were both a threat and an opportunity at the same time. She didn't know what kind of game he was playing, or what kind of test he wanted her to pass. But the fear was overwhelming. She had no idea what he was capable of, no idea how far he would go. She just knew that this wasn't just a matter of an apology anymore. This was something much bigger, something that could change the course of her entire life. She stood there frozen, feeling the weight of his gaze upon her, knowing that the next words she spoke would determine everything. She had no idea how to prove herself to someone like him. But one thing was clear, she was in deeper than she ever could have imagined, and there was no turning back now.